Good morning and welcome. I'm Don Guttenplan. I'm the education writer for the International Herald Tribune, and I want to welcome you this morning to our debate on education and the environment supporting sustainability. So right now, I'd like you to join me in welcoming our panel to the stage. To my left is Professor Yusen Asuka, who's the director of the Climate Change Group and the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies and professor of environmental policy at the Center for Northeast Asian Studies at Tokyo University. Next to him is Ms. Elizabeth Thompson, who's the Assistant Secretary General and Executive Coordinator of the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, Rio +20. And finally, we have Dr. David Noestbakken, who's a lecturer at Carleton University and president of China Green Channel. And I'm going to ask each of them in turn, starting with Yusen, to explain what they hope to accomplish by being here.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very much delighted and very much excited about doing this kind of things. I'm professor at the Tohoku University. Tohoku University is located in Sendai, and Sendai is next to Fukushima Prefecture. So everybody knows what happened last year in Japan, in Fukushima. So I will mention the climate change issue, nuclear issues, energy policy, what happened, and what had changed before and after Fukushima accident. Also, I'm very interested in the debate on ethics or equity along the climate change issue. And actually, I will come again back to Qatar next week to join the COP, Conference of Party for Climate Change Negotiation. So I will mention about the climate change and nuclear power plant and also equity. And so I'm very much excited, and I do my best to bring you, ask you to bring many things from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yusen. Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this very important dialogue. I'm here essentially to share with other participants the Higher Education Sustainability Initiative, which I developed and launched as part of my effort for Rio +20. It has attracted the signatory of in excess of 300 universities from over 50 countries since its launch. The core of the initiative is to try to get institutions of higher learning to become practitioners of sustainability and to develop graduates who are practitioners of sustainability. So essentially, the universities which have joined have agreed to the core elements, which are that they will teach sustainability as a core discipline across all modules, that they will green their campuses, that they will develop a body of literature and research and case studies around issues of sustainability, that they will green their supply chains and procurement policies, and where there are large campuses which have on-campus contained transportation systems, that they will convert these to green or alternative methods of transportation. So that's what I want to be discussing.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. David.
Yes, I also want to express appreciation for being invited here today with this panel and with you, Mr. Moderator. I guess I would say I am a serial social entrepreneur. I've developed a number of companies around social issues, particularly environment, in the area of information and communication technologies. And my interest lies in using these technologies for these social purposes, but not in isolation of institutions that have been set up around those issues, and in this case, schools and universities. And we are exploring ways of enjoining the informal learning processes that are going on, whether we want them to or not, and the formal education institutions set up for formal learning. My perception is that the way we've structured our educational institutions like all institutions, when there's rapid change, it's hard for them to keep up. And so our efforts are to try and make the link in a comfortable and constructive way. And I hope that we have a chance to discuss that a bit here today.
Great. I'm going to start off the debate by asking Elizabeth, it seems like you're basically asking institutions of higher education to do two things. One is to change what they teach, and the other is to change how they act. And it sounds wonderful that you have so many signatories already for this initiative. But I wonder, what are the metrics you use? You know, people in education know you can't have a class, or it's difficult to have a class without grades. So how are you grading them? What do we look at to make sure that they're actually acting and not just complying verbally?
I think the metrics have to be considered at two levels. The first is, how do we ensure that when we say teach sustainability, that one module content is comparable with another module content at a university in a different country, for instance. And we are in the process now of discussing with the universities themselves the development of metrics by which we can measure an objective standard for use across all of the signatory universities in all 50 countries, and of course in other universities which are going to join. I think the second level of metrics has to do more with the results. Will we see, and since the initiative is very new, let's say in a year from now, will we see that a number of companies have recognized, because their graduates are more sensitive and their new employees are more sensitive to the issue, will we see that a number of companies have strengthened their corporate social responsibility, are asking questions like, how do I increase my shareholder value and drive up my profit margins while at the same time being cognizant that I have to protect the natural resource base? How do we develop innovate and develop new technologies which are going to deliver goods and services without waste of the natural resources? And I think that some of the consequences, some of the metrics are things that you and I and everybody else will be able to recognize, because there will be visible change.
Can you give us some examples of the ones, I mean, in a year, what should we recognize? What should we see?
I think in a year, we should see an announcement by far more companies, both large companies and small and medium-sized enterprises, that they have developed environmental policies, that they are more cognizant of issues relating to responsible investment, driving shareholder value while reducing their impact on the environment, shrinking their ecological footprint, but maximizing their profit margins. Those are the kinds of things that I think we can look to see in a year, as well as a larger number of graduates who understand what sustainability means in the context of their discipline or area of enterprise.
So if I've understood this correctly, your hope is to leverage changing what's taught in terms of these modules and the mindset of graduates as a force for change throughout society. That
perfectly correct.
Okay,
yes.
Good. I'm glad I've understood. Yusen, as we know, social change isn't always easy. There are opposing interests, and I'd like perhaps for you to tell us and our audience a bit about both what your sense of the opposing interests were towards sustainability in Japan before Fukushima and the accident, and then what kind of impact that had in terms of attitudes towards sustainability, particularly in the academic sector.
Okay, because now we are WISE debate, so I would like to introduce what kind of debate we are having in Japan. And the debate, one of the debate topic is nuclear power generation is environmentally friendly technology or not. And before Fukushima, in terms of education, the school textbook says it's okay. It's not technology is safe, but the system is a problem. That is kind of textbook
So the
argument.
textbook approach was to quiet any anxieties.
Yes, and that is, I don't say it's censorship, but it's kind of inspection or suggestion from Minister of Education. So junior high school and high school students didn't have kind of, I say, broad, comprehensive understanding of the safety, because the logic was it is safe because it's safe. That's kind of the logic about in the textbook. But of course, after Fukushima, everything has changed, and now we are very open to pose question whether it is really safe. Actually, it was not safe. But again, it's trade-off between climate change mitigation action and the role of nuclear power plants. So those kind of debates still.
Can I ask you to get a little bit behind that and
Yes.
say, who were the social actors who were pushing denial of climate change before, and what were the sort of forces in Japanese society that were saying nuclear power is fine and we shouldn't talk about it? I mean, was it the power companies? Was it politicians? Was it?
Both. I don't want to use the word corruption, but very
Okay,
close.
don't use the word corruption. That
I'm
would be
sorry.
shocking.
But close relationship between politicians, policymakers, and utility company. Also, very good connection with academics and news media. And so, in terms of the vested interest, the people around power generation, they are very, very powerful in many senses. But now it has changed, and I hope it will become in good kind of improve the system, Japanese political system in good way in terms of climate change as well.
Thank you. David, we've been talking about universities as places where people learn and as places where there are certain social practices, but I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about universities as institutions and the way they act in the environment as institutions, and what leverage points there might be.
First, I'd like to maybe ask the question, is there something about issues of the environment or sustainable development that would suggest suggest that an inquiry approach or an experiential approach or a non-didactic approach might serve better than the kind of lecture approach which still, I think, dominates too much of what goes on in universities. I mean,
So you're saying, is the environment a topic that might prompt new ways of thinking?
Yeah, yes,
or demand new ways of thinking?
I think that the education relating to environment starts at kindergarten, not at university. I liked what someone said in the early panel, that we should invert the pyramid and see the priorities starting at young children and moving up to university, especially on an issue like environment. And the approach to it should be an inquiry approach rather than a didactic approach. And it should be integrated in the sense that you don't isolate environment from other issues of economics and politics and social movement and poverty and peace and conflict and all other issues that relate to the subject. So it should be integrated, not isolated. It should be experiential as much as possible. In my country, there's not a single community in our country that doesn't have at least one environmental group or movement of some kind. So there's lots of opportunity for students to participate in society directly as part of what they do as students. If you do those three things, innovate ways of doing those three things, that leads to a fourth aspect, I think, important, which is stewardship. Is that we want young people to thrive academically on issues of environment. That's one thing, their conceptual ability being, and their capacity to think creatively, obviously important. But if we want them to be the leaders of tomorrow and to solve problems in ways that we haven't done well, we need to take an inquiry approach. And keeping in mind, our young people are learning informally, online, and social networking, and it's very important that we legitimize that as part of their learning process within our institutions.
And by an inquiring approach, I assume you mean something different from sitting in a hall and listening to a lecture, but maybe you could be a little more detailed about how that works in terms of environmental questions, even starting at grade school.
Well, I'll tell you what I do in my class at Carleton University. It's my view on an issue like environment, like an issue like peace, that to get young people inspired and charged up on it intellectually and in practical terms, you have to start with them, their own life, their own passions, their own dreams, what they want to do with their life. So my approach in my classes, which are on social entrepreneurship, by the way, is to spend a lot of time getting them to look at themselves, to identify what matters to them, and determine how they may act on that, both within their course of studies and in what they do in later life. So that leads to the point when I say an inquiry approach is important. It should be a student-centered approach. We need the roots of their leadership to start with who they are, what they believe in, what matters to them.
But if we're giving people a chance to talk about what matters to them, and we're open to people setting their own priorities, I'm wondering, and I'm hoping you'll come in on this, Elizabeth, how much the environment is sort of a dictated priority, particularly if you're in a poorer country. I mean, if you're in a country where you have lots of money for university buildings and you can afford to tear out your old coal-fired heating plant and put in a solar plant, or you can afford to build a new green wastewater treatment system, that's fine. But what if you're in a country where the money for making a campus greener might be spent on textbooks or might be spent on teacher salaries? In other words, how do you deal with the environment as a competing priority in a set of other priorities, particularly in countries that don't have the luxury of pursuing all their priorities with equal vigor?
There are always going to be competing priorities. I think that if we continue to isolate environmental issues as being out there and separate and distinct from the economic issues, separate and distinct from the social issues, then we're always going to have a challenge, and we're never going to be able to mainstream these issues to have the long-term beneficial impacts which are ideal and for which we must strive. In relation to making decisions on how you allocate your budgeting and your expenditure, you could look, for instance, let's say you have a number of buildings on a campus in a developing country. You look at one of the buildings and you say, okay, if I take X dollars to retrofit this year, to make the building green, that will result in a saving in water, electricity consumption, waste usage, etc. That will give me a yield of Z dollars. And that increased yield, I am then going to buy the additional textbooks that I want. Ultimately, when one makes a typical example, if I can use from the energy sector, because this is an energy-producing country, BP, prior to the spill in the Gulf, made the point that they earned something like $1 billion in additional profits from a $20 million investment in climate adaptation and climate change policy initiatives and retrofitting. The point that I'm making is every entity, every physical entity, every company, every individual has some sort of budget with which they operate. And if they look at investing in green technologies and in greening activities, if they make the investment in natural resources, ultimately, the kinds of cost savings that they make can then be used for other kinds of activities and other kinds of investments.
Yusin, it seems like we're converging on the viewpoint that you can't really isolate environmental questions from questions of social justice. And I wondered whether you see that playing out, whether you would disagree with that. I mean, we're having a debate, so please feel free to disagree. Or whether whether you think they're connected, and how, if they are connected, how that's playing out in Japan.
Okay, about priority issues, we have the same problem in Japan. Even Japan is kind of developed countries. Always energy saving and those kind of investment, long-term thinking is a bit difficult for general public to understand even in Japan. So as I am economist, so I do those kind of calculation. I try to convince Japanese people that you better invest now and you will get a better kind of result in the mid and long term. But that kind of idea will not easy to be accepted even in Japan. So we have the same problem. About social justice, yes, the reason because I'm working on climate change negotiation, and every time we talk about climate change negotiation, we come up with the idea of equity. But the issue is, what is the definition of equity? And of course, it's very difficult. But without discussion on equity, we will not reach any agreement. Yeah, that is sure.
And what sort of, I mean, in terms of equity as it relates to environmental questions, I mean, you partly have the question of the commons. I'm thinking of campuses that I've been on where you see students just sitting on the lawn having soda, then throwing their cans away because they assume somebody else is going to come along and clean it up. Or you see enormous consumption of paper or resources, or they print out catalogs every term, and then the catalogs get left in mounds. Maybe they get recycled. So what do you mean when you say equity?
For example, I want to try to be specific.
Good.
Okay, then for example, the nuclear power plant issues, then equity is equity between our generation and next generation. And in terms of nuclear power plant, we have nuclear waste. Right. So it's good to put those kind of responsibility to future generation or not. That is very, very ethical and equitable kind of discussion between, and also the thing is we don't have the people who debate because we don't talk with as a future generation.
You mean because they can't speak for themselves?
Yeah, so we have to decide, and I think this is very, very ethical question, and so that I think that is a fundamental kind of reason of the diversion in Japan about the nuclear power plant. And
Elizabeth, in terms of equity, is it a transnational issue? Are there different standards? Are there controversies over what constitutes equity in the environment? Maybe you could sketch some of that out for us.
Yes, I think that there are controversies and there are varying perceptions, varying classifications of what constitutes equity. And clearly, you would have to appreciate that countries and people at different stages of development are going to see equity in different ways. In the United States, equity might be everybody having a car in the garage and access to electrical power. In a village in Africa, it might be whether or not there can be power in the village at all. So there are always going to be concerns over issues of equity. I think, however, that if you see sustainable development, if you see environmental issues as a protection of our natural resource base so that future generations can also have access to a sustainable quality of life, then you can define equity in that way. How does this generation act? How do we consume? How do we produce? What standards do we put in place to ensure that we do not so pollute the earth? I mean, scientists now talk about living in the era of the Anthropocene and the capacity of the individual to so alter the environment that it is irreversible. Is that desirable? Or do we want to consume and produce in a way that leaves something for our children and grandchildren. And ultimately, I think that's how we have to see equity. All of us, wherever we are in the world, whoever we are, of whatever ethnicity, we want to have a better future for our children. And the only way that can happen is if we protect the natural resource base, which generates the economic gains and the social benefits for all of us. And that's really what equity is about.
David, I wanted to ask you, you've advocated an inquiry method for talking about sustainability with students. And in a way, that's something that a lot of people at WISE have been talking about for a long time, which is learning from the bottom up. So I wondered if you could tell us some of the things, as a practitioner of the inquiry method, that you've learned from your students about changing the environment, either initiatives that they've come up with or perspectives that seemed fresh to you.
I may take a bit of tack from your question to respond a little bit to what was being
Sure,
said
good,
there
it's a
first.
debate.
After the Earth Summit in 1992, and the Agenda 21 came out, and Agenda 21, in one of its sections, talked about the importance of information and communication and cultural self-expression. And so I worked at IDRC, International Development Research Center at that time. We took it upon ourselves to create a global television service based on a Canadian model of a network I'd started in Canada, essentially to support independent producers in their communities and cultures around the world, including in the South, to express themselves on issues of sustainable development. The notion being that cultural diversity and its expression is akin to and as important as biodiversity and its expression. The issues of environment are the issues of people and how they act. And people are different. There's diversity in who we are, including economically and socially, but certainly culturally. And at that time, in the early 90s, notwithstanding all the technologies we had, we still did not know who we were in the world. And we had not created mechanisms to better reflect those realities. When 9/11 happened, it became clear how little we knew about ourselves in certain parts of the world. Now, 9/11 and the dot-com crash kind of dampened the business that we'd created on this global network. We had 100 partners, 100 national broadcasters as partners. But then the internet had emerged, and it became evident that we need to, we segued from broadcast service to an internet service, which is now called Ecology Global Network. You can find it at ecology.com on the computer. The idea of ecology.com relates in part to the topic today, what we've created which is called Ecology Campus Network. This is, we have connected with 2,000 universities around the world that have what are called, loosely, environmental courses or programs.
And are they, I'm going to just interrupt for a second, are they courses in the geography department, in the biology department, is there a special department, or do
all of those?
All of
those. Okay. The ones that we're most interested in are those they call environmental studies, which are integrating of a wide number of disciplines.
So they're interdisciplinary.
Yes. Now, the idea of this is we see campuses, and I hope this doesn't sound crass, not just as institutions of learning, but places where young people go. And we believe if we connect with universities, we can reach young people where they are. We have 300 universities around the world who have student environmental clubs or groups, and we're linked to them. The idea of this service is to get those students to shape this platform we've built. Very much like to have the the WISE 2012 learners on this case, but we're getting these students in these campuses around the world to shape a platform for them to better share their experiences from their cultural and social perspectives. Those things they've done that they are excited about in their region in a kind of Facebook fashion on this service, in order for them to learn informally and to inquire based on peer-to-peer kind of interactions. At the same time, we are working with an Irish-based university initiative called Global Conversation, which has 17 countries and 17 universities taking a course virtually on environment and accrediting it in their universities. And it's a way for students in these different universities to interact with students in other universities culturally and for a greater depth of learning on the issues as it relates to who we are as diverse peoples around the world.
Elizabeth, you wanted to come in briefly?
Yes, thank you. I really just sort of wanted to make the point that I think this is raising a very interesting issue. Where does one locate environmental studies? And I want to bring an example, a very recent one. Hurricane Sandy, which struck the United States within the last few weeks, was a Category 1 hurricane, the lowest possible Category hurricane. If you consider that it could have been a Category 5, which is the highest level. And if you then start to make the connections between an extreme weather event, the implications for families, the impact on your physical infrastructure, the cost in loss of productivity, loss of time in the marketplace, etc., then you start to see where the connections to economy come, to society, to quality of living. And when we teach environment, therefore, we cannot have it there as a standalone subject. We really have to create the linkages and what the social and economic costs for either not dealing or dealing with environmental issues are. One could easily ask the question, if there were a higher level of building standards in the United States, would there have been so much damage to the infrastructure, especially in relation to houses and buildings? If people planned for these events and used backup systems, if they were on renewable energy platforms, for instance, would the extent of the damage be the same? Would the costs and losses have been the same? So that is where I think we need to move the discussion on environment and education for environment to recognize that environmental education really is education about life and preparing for every aspect of our social and economic existence.
Yusin, I wondered whether you wanted to come in, because there's certainly a sense in which for people who are concerned about the environment, which I assume includes all of you here, certainly includes all of us up here, Sandy, although a tragedy in many ways for many people, was also a teachable moment. But in a way, in Japan, Fukushima was a bigger teachable moment. And you have a lot of inertia, but it sounds like that inertia is difficult to sustain, since we're talking about sustainability.
Yes, first, I didn't know the Hurricane Sandy was Category 1, so it was quite shocking for me. And because but science and economics, those kind of things, I'm fighting against climate change skeptics in Japan, so they are suing me. So, but anyway, it's very difficult scientific perspective to attribute one extreme event to climate change. But we have to manage to convince people. And also, in that sense, the most important principle is precautionary principle. But in Japan, in the textbook, we don't teach those kind of things.
So spell out a little bit, very
Yes.
briefly, what you mean by the precautionary principle.
Precautionary is better to prepare in the beginning rather than having big, severe kind of negative impact.
Okay.
So again, it's short-term investment will pay for long-term in the long term. So, but again, it's very difficult to define how long and how much, and also with the economic people, industry people come in and say it's too expensive, electricity price will go up, and the international competitiveness of Japanese company will be lost. Those kind of discussion we are having, even now.
Well,
then that was actually the inertia in Japan, and people don't want. Of course,
people don't want to. They don't want to allocate the resources.
Allocate resource, yes, but they don't. They say yes, but when they face increase of electricity price, they say no, or they may say they are very concerned. So they prefer no drastic change. So now that is kind of controversial things in Japan. So we are not yet sure how soon we will phase out nuclear power plant. According to current administration's policy, we are supposed to phase out the nuclear power plant in 2030s. That means by 2039, but it's not yet sure because maybe next administration will change the policy. So now some people protest on the street every Friday in front of the Diet, but
to make sure they keep the promise.
Yeah, but it's very difficult to say what will happen in Japan.
I want to share with you something that happened to me about 8 weeks ago. I was in New York, and I was standing on Roosevelt Island, which is an island in the middle of the East River. Well, I could have visited you if I'd only known. Well, I was there to visit Four Freedoms Park, which is a new park that they've just dedicated to the memory of Franklin Roosevelt and to the four freedoms he enunciated at the end of the Second World War. And one of the things that I found out about this park is that it was designed in the 1970s, but it was only opened now. It was only built now. And they had to change the original design because the East River has risen 5 inches since the 1970s due to climate change. So that intrigued me because that's a fact, which sort of they had to accept, and they had to take it into consideration in their design. And I wonder whether part of our role as educators, or your role as educators, since I'm just a newspaper man, but isn't in a way to do the opposite of what you were saying, David, which is to stand up for expertise, to say, yes, we have debates and we want to know where you are and we want to respect your point of view, but there are certain facts that we know and we can stand behind them and we should act on them. And that in a way, part of what's happened in the discussion of the environment maybe is that we've gotten overwhelmed by the idea of not too much democracy of opinion, but a kind of failure of expertise to sort of defend itself. And I wondered whether you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I don't think anyone wants to argue against or argue for eliminating information and factual data from our educational system. Not suggesting that at all. It's how you approach it, how you have your students approach it, how you provide them an experience and then a way to analyze that experience. You know, I read on the airplane on the way here that well-known scientific journal, Rolling Stone, that had an article in it reducing in a very useful way the issues in a readable and digestible fashion, quoting the general agreement that came out of Copenhagen that by mid-century we should not exceed 2 more degrees Celsius, right? At the same time, there is general agreement, at least with the panel on climate change, that we shouldn't exceed 565 gigatons of CO2 by mid-century. But if you calculate how much CO2 there already is in the oil and coal that has been identified for consumption in that period of time, That's 5 times the 565 gigatons. So the likelihood of only increasing our temperature by 2% is really, it's a rather terrifying prospect. So given that, we might ask the question, is the way we're treating this subject in our academic institutions at the moment up to...
Is it urgent enough?
Is it up to this reality?
Yes.
And if it isn't, what do we need to do to ameliorate that? Well, my point is lecturing them about how serious the problem is not the way.
Okay.
They need to know this, but what we need we need to release their creative energy and their digitized capacities to take leadership that we can't do. So that's my hope, that if we give our students an opportunity to show us what they can do with this data, we're better off.
I think that's actually a terrific point to go to the audience for questions. I really wanted to start off with, to pick up on what you said, which is, you know, that we know the task before us, and we know that our efforts aren't nearly urgent enough to meet the task before us. So how does education bridge that gap? What do we, you know, what do we do? What do we need to focus on? What do we need to change?
This is Marta Llanos from Peru, and I like very much to report the following. First of all, to deal with issues of environment, and especially on looking at sustainability, we have to start with very early years of life. I totally agree with the presenter, because around the world, we start having early childhood programs in which we are embedding perhaps not so much teaching, but remember that when we are dealing with the small children, we are using very much arts and play, who are the forgotten things of many human beings, and that's the fundamental of human. Now, to look into sustainability is a very deep element that goes into your personal development. And so I captured that, what was coming from the presentation, that is not only teaching about facts and figures and elements that happen, but also is this quality of caring capacity for yourself and for the environment. And therefore, these are embedded things that from early years of life, education could really bring about on starting from small children. So this will be a comment that I would like to present to you, please. Thank you.
David, would you care to come back at that, just because it seems to take up on the kinds of things you've been talking about?
Well, I agree, obviously. Listen, I'll just tell a little story. I have a friend, Oscar Matamoro, who has a company in Brazil called Amana-K. And what he does is to work with the Fortune 500 businesses of Brazil to help them rethink their businesses. And he does it, these are overstuffed, very wealthy, and sometimes corrupt businessmen. And what he does is to get them to ask themselves, when you were a child, what mattered to you? What really turned your crank as a youngster? And once you go back there, and there are tears in the eyes of these businessmen, once you go back there, ask yourself, how much of those ideals are you applying to your company? How social responsible and environmentally friendly are you? He uses it as a way of causing us to rethink what we do as adults by going back into our childhood, which reinforces the notion that what we do with our children is extremely important. It informs us in later life.
So let me just share that in Peru, I have developed, and it's going around the world. I'm not here to make propaganda, but really the results are very impact. I have created a program called Peace Ambassador. And the Green Peace Ambassadors are the little ones, starting from 3 years old, to work together with parents, with teachers, adolescents, and you name it. And they go around the world, they plant trees, they talk about the importance of keeping clean. And also they came just about 2 weeks ago. I did the research with the university PhD students, and they came to add on something. They told me, Martita, because they call me Martita, these little ones, they said there is another kind of pollution. When people speak very bad, when people are talking very badly about their neighbors, when people are gossiping, and I realized how much wisdom on the children's world and how much we can learn from them. Thank you very much.
If I may just follow up one small point on that. I also, what I described Oscar Matamaro doing, I do in my class on social entrepreneurship. Before you can get students to commit to taking on a cause by building a social responsible business behind it, they first have to want to do that. So I need to ask them, even at 21 and 22, go back into when you were a child and remember what really mattered to you and bring it up now. And if it still matters to you now, you can act on it now.
Great. Number 2.
I'm Joseph Junior, coming from Cameroon. Okay, merci beaucoup.
Hello. Yes, I would like to thank the panelists for having provided specific information. Now, we have talked a lot about the environmental approach in universities, but what about in the primary schools as well? Because not everybody goes all the way to university. So what can you do to bring about innovation and to include the environmental aspects and environmental stewardship in primary schools as well? This is particularly for children who don't necessarily reach higher education and university education.
Children are allowed to play. They have a relationship with the environment. They go to the park. They play outside in the dirt. They see worms and insects and flowers. And we teach children about nature and about biology without making the connections. I do not believe that higher education and teaching very young children about environment are mutually exclusive. I think both have to happen. That from the time children are very young, we have to teach them to care for their environment, to be respectful of nature, and so on. But because we have very significant challenges like climate change that require high-level interventions in the business sector, at the wider social level, we also have to teach it at university level, and we have to start that now, so that the two must take place simultaneously. That from very early we are teaching a sense of environment and environmental protection to our children and explaining to them why, and they learn by doing, by being part of exercises, by having fun activities. But at the same time, there has to be a more formal sustainability training at secondary and tertiary levels. But there must be sustainability education across the board to all people going through the educational system at whatever level. I just started with an initiative for higher education because I figured that a significant thrust needs to be made at that level if we are to get to 2 degrees, if we are to make some paradigm shifts and radical changes in the shortest possible time.
Okay. Sir, on the front row, please.
I am Abdulaziz Al-Kindi, Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs from the University of Nizwa in Oman. I'd like to make 2 comments. The first one, I think for universities to adopt and incorporate sustainability as a universal theme is not that very challenging. A few hundreds of faculty in every university can easily donate some effort here and there to create a chain of programs where this value becomes a core theme in the university life for all students. For example, you can have a major and an endless number of minors. You can say engineering plus a minor in sustainability, sociology plus a minor in sustainability. Sustainability is no longer science or engineering based. It is there from psychology, sociology to bring about the change in a very global theme. So there is good news there. There is a need, though, from university to take that effort. Only few universities around, including even countries like the United States, which has developed so many interdisciplinary measures, they are still not making use of what they have as resources. That's the first comment. So I think we can bring about change through universities that way, through special courses as it was discussed in lower education, basic education. That is my first comment. The second comment, I think we need also to bring awareness. I would like to be very bold here. Mother Earth has been infected, we call it in biological science, with an obligated parasite. It's there in that big organism, crippling it. And this is the corporate, ugly capitalist thinking, line of thinking in the world. I'm not meaning whether it is a country or a company or an individual. I'm meaning here that opportunist line of thinking of getting a profit. Whether we are an individual or a corporate or a country, it doesn't matter. At the end, we are over-exploiting Mother Earth. We go around trying to diagnose what went wrong in sustaining the environment. And yet we hide from this fact. We have to be bold there and identify the main cause. We may sit today here and talk and ask universities and other educational institutes to take the load. But yet, what a war or a company destroying somewhere or individuals destroying the environment in their own localities are bringing far more destruction than what we are calling for. So I think we need to be bold there. We need to change the line of thinking of the corporate, the individuals, the policymakers, and the most importantly, the politicians. A decision to go into a war between two countries, we all know here how much it will affect the sustainability, how much destruction. Today in the morning, we talked about millions of children were not able to access education. Is that because they were only poor? No. I think this is also other factors. We need to come far more braver and far more bold to really adhere to them and say what should be, what is the right thing about it. So I hope that this awareness will be also global awareness for the need of sustainability at all levels. Thank you.
So you're partly saying we need to not just change the way we talk, but also the way we think.
Exactly.
Yusin, do you want to come in on that? The question of how you get people to change the way they think and how difficult that is or whether it's possible. What do you think?
I'm sorry, but I don't have any clear answer, but I fully agree with you that it's very difficult to change people's mind. I'm a bit specific about climate change negotiation because the climate change negotiation is based on consensus. So if one country is saying no, we don't have any consensus, then we can't proceed to the next stage. And some people, I say president is skeptic about climate change. So if say no to climate change negotiation, nobody, everything stop. That is kind of reality of the climate change negotiation. And I agree with you that we got to be very, very bold. So we have to change, and sometimes we have to be aggressive. But sometimes that may have negative impact, and they become more inner-looking, and they don't want to see the reality, and they want to have more fantasy life. So that's the facing, and I don't have any answer. I'm sorry.
I'm pointing to you that because I don't think the trees, the oceans, and animals, and the rest of the universe around us, or in Mother Nature even around us, brought these global warming problems and other problems. We humans brought it. And there's a famous verse in the Quran, and I'd like to remind, which is good to quote. It says, corruption, environmental or non-environment, is brought by the hand of man. We were searching for a course to teach basic awareness. And I think we need to bring this awareness to the young generation, but it is not going to be enough. Okay, we will have the rest of the population aware, but still there is a problem in the decision-making process. So there has to be that awareness, that line of thinking you mentioned, need to be tackled because that's what will bring change about.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Could I just make a comment, moderator, on that
Oh,
one?
sorry, I'm looking in the wrong direction.
Max Planck, one of the grandfathers of quantum physics, said the way to get a new scientific principle accepted is to wait for the old scientists to die. So changing mindset is extremely difficult. It's easier to crystallize and support already held attitudes and beliefs than it is to change them. What's great about what we're talking about, young people in grade school and university, they're already there. They already have a sense. Our surveys show in many countries a strong sense of the urgency of environment, notwithstanding the fact that we're an urbanizing world, and there's an emerging syndrome called nature deficit syndrome, because kids grow up in urban centers and never see trees, you know. But nonetheless, the young people are already there, so our task is to aid and abet what's already there. And real social change, especially on an issue as important as environment, is really generational. So if we can support this current generation effectively, then the next generation will see change.
So we have to support them, and we also have to get out of their way, presumably.
Yes, yes.
Number 4 in the back there, sir. And then I'm going to come to you next.
Hello, everyone. Dr. Anderson Uviemegbo is my name. I represent GAPS Academy. I'm from Nigeria. Listening to you all, I've been very worried. And I'm worried for a simple reason. Some weeks ago, we had in Nigeria the worst natural disaster that the nation has ever witnessed. Almost 70% of the country was flooded. Millions of people became homeless. Thousands of acres of farmland destroyed. So obviously there's going to be famine next year. Right now I'm holding with me a document from the Presidential Committee on Flood Relief and Rehabilitation, of which I've been co-opted to help with. But why, as I listen to you now, I get very worried. Because one, with all the disasters that have befallen us, I don't hear anyone talk about education, teaching anyone about sustainability. You know, everything's about reconstruction, relief, how do we help, but the big picture of why it happened, how it happened, how do we, I've not heard anything. I've been in meetings where international developmental bodies have not said anything about education. Nothing is taught in school at any level about it. You know, so I sat here asking myself, I don't know so much about the environment. I should have been in other sessions. But the reason I'm sitting here is that I'm part of a committee in which I do not see a lot of progress in this area, and I'm worried. So what does a country that has just witnessed a miniature version of Hurricane Sandy do? How do we educate everyone across board? What do we begin to take practical steps now that will work for us? You know, and what action point can I take away as an individual, as someone who's running a content-based platform? What can I do, and what should we do as a country as regards educating people about sustainability? Thank you.
I'm going to ask members of the panel if they want to come in, but I have one thing to say. I'm going to give you a small commercial, which is after this discussion and after lunch, we're having a forum on education and the environment and what works. And one of the people speaking at the forum, which I have the pleasure of moderating, is going to focus specifically on education as a human right in post-disaster situations. So very much speaking to your specific question. But one of the places where I know there's been a lot of work done and where there was a very impressive effort to reform education after a natural disaster was in Fukushima, where there were, you had teachers organizing emergency schools. They reorganized the curriculum. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, Yusin?
Yes, I can talk about the Japanese situation, but again, at the same time, as I said, the disaster in Fukushima was so severe for Japanese people. So, for Japanese people, like country in Africa or as an international society, they are a bit far apart from our daily life. That means we couldn't think about so much about what is happening in the world, what's happening in Africa. That is reality, I'm sorry to say, but that's first things. And having said that, again, so I think issue is about the environmental issue. We talked about equity, but the other side of the coin is responsibility. And we don't, again, so in terms of climate change, we developed countries, for example, have more bigger responsibility, but people don't want to admit that is the kind of most difficult barrier we have to clear, but it's not so easy. And if we admit the responsibility in negotiation or in 2 weeks in Qatar, everything will change, but we don't want to admit responsibility, especially historical responsibility or per capita responsibility. So that's why I think the negotiation will not go smoothly. But again, people don't want to feel responsibility in that sense.
Do either of you want to come in on the question of education and the way after something like a flooding or a disaster, people talk about reconstruction, and education clearly has to be part of that reconstruction. I assume that's part of what you're getting at, sir.
Where I'm driving at is this. Before the disaster, there wasn't any education. During and after the disaster, there's still no education. And I can give you 2 influences that education could have helped. One, even though the disaster was natural, a lot of people practices contributed. People built around natural drainages and many other things around that contributed. So today you find out that even the schools that should teach kids are being used for internal displaced persons. So thousands of schools across the nation. So the point I'm driving at is, how do you teach sustainability in an economy and a culture where people don't believe it, they don't practice it, where there are no behaviors, where all that sustainability there is that they plant trees once a year during annual tree planting campaigns, and then send people for wonderful workshops like this, and they go back home and deliver papers and nobody does anything about it. And there's nothing in the curriculum that is about this, and there's no change in actual behavior on the streets or on the ground that promotes this.
So you're partly asking or challenging us to say, you have to convince people they have a stake in it. I'm going to go over there to 2.
My name is Eduardo. I'm from Colombia, and I'm from the Learners Voice program for this year. And thinking in collaborating for change, and in my work in Colombia, I have this opportunity to promote and create this biotechnology sector in Colombia, and it's the responsible use of biodiversity. So in every day we are trying to know how in the developing countries we can talk about this new vision of education, this new vision of use and conserve the biodiversity, but how we can do that if we don't have an appropriate framework to coordinate all the countries like Colombia to involve in this global movement about biodiversity and environment before, for example, Rio Plus 20. I have the opportunity to be in there, and are many challenges for a country like Colombia to involve in this new goal for the United Nations. So what a country like Colombia can do to create the correct framework to work with the biodiversity in a responsible way?
I'm going to ask Elizabeth to come in on that, because
How did I know that?
You're the international person here.
countries across the world are members of the United Nations family. I think that sometimes getting the political will and the political action and getting private sector buying to some of these concepts can be very difficult, and that some of it has to be initiated by citizens, by populations, by civil society, saying to government and saying to the private sector, there are things that we want you to do. There are things that we want you to be cognizant of. There are actions that you need to take, policy decisions, programs, etc. And then putting pressure on the principal actors at the political level, at the level of the private sector, to get movement on issues of substance. But Colombia has led in the Rio Plus 20 process the initiative for the development of a set of sustainable development goals that will be of broader reach than the Millennium Development Goals and will have broader thematic grounding, because as you know, the Millennium Development Goals didn't deal with some areas like water, like energy, very critical issues. So that Colombia is very much a part of the process. Colombia is also a signatory to the Biodiversity Treaty and to many other international agreements and treaties. What governments agree to and what governments implement becomes a divide, not just of policy, but of what citizens will allow. When citizens put pressure on governments, when citizens put pressure on their individual state or community representatives, politicians respond to that, because ultimately, political parties want to be re-elected to office. And they do that through responding to citizens' wills, citizens' initiatives, citizens' desires, citizens' directives. And communities must therefore speak out, put pressure, organize themselves, and both formally and informally. The kind of change that we are talking about is not going to happen overnight. It has to happen at several levels by several sectors and stakeholders across societies, across the world, taking action, thinking differently, acting differently, and creating that change. It will not happen in a week, and it's not going to happen in a month. But the very fact that so many of you are participating in this discussion means that there is a sensitivity to the issue. And as more and more, as we start to link natural disasters with climate change, with economic consequences, with social fallout, as we start to think of green issues, of environmental issues, not as externalities, but internal and mainstream to our broader development, to our social and economic gains, then the kind of behavioral change which will protect our natural resource base, because it means protecting our society and economy, that is the change that will take place.
Thank you. So your job is to mobilize civil society and to hold your politicians to account.
Hold politicians.
Okay. Number 3.
Yes, my name is Madame Bousso. I come from Senegal. I'm a science teacher and I'm an inspector for secondary education, a supervisor. Today we're talking about education for the environment, and we talk about collaborating for change. This is why I wanted to ask a question. Well, it's not really a question, but I wanted to share something with you. Today, when we talk about environmental education, it should be for the benefit of society. Society should really, get a lot of benefits from environmental education. And here we have an experience in Senegal. We have the supervisors, inspectors who are there to influence the politicians, tell them how to act. And our experiment is the following. we want to develop environmental education in what we call the mission statements of the various schools. As you know, even in developing countries, you have schools everywhere. Even in the most remote areas, you have schools. And there, we felt it was very important to include environmental education in every school. And our project is the following. We ask the pupils to develop a research project. Every school will decide to emphasize the most serious environmental problem in their locality. If we're near the sea, we can talk about coastal areas. If the school is close to an orchard, we'll talk about the production of the orchard. If it's close to the garbage dump, then the pupils will talk about household waste and all that, and pollution. And of course, we have done a school mapping. We know how many schools we have. And therefore, the government will know exactly how many environmental problems have been identified. And now we have to act. Now we already have mapped the problems, you see. And now, second good thing, the primary school pupil starts his project. When it comes to secondary education, then he goes deeper into his project. And when he goes to university, or she goes to university, well, he or she has all the necessary elements to really solve this environmental problem, which they have been following from primary school to secondary school to higher education, to university. This is what I wanted to share with you. This is what we're doing with our government. And this is, as I was saying, what we wanted to share with the panel members. Thank you for having listened to me.
I want to thank you for your statement, but also to, so we've heard that in Senegal, they have mobilized pupils in schools as a kind of environmental inspectorate, where the pupils draw attention to problems in their areas, and the pupils report on what the problems are, and then the statement is that the pupils presumably follow with interest the response of the government. And that strikes me as a wonderful idea, but also a dangerous one, because if you give the students the idea that they are responsible for the environment and the government is going to respond to them, then the government had better respond to them. But it sounds like a really interesting innovation, so please keep us posted as to how this develops. We have number 4 over there, and number 1, and I think that's going to be our last question, those two. So number 4, please. And if I'm sorry to say this at this point, but if you can keep it relatively brief, because we are running out of time.
My name is Brian O'Connell. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. Jerome Bruner speaks of cultures as knowledge amplification systems. You understand a culture by the knowledge it amplifies, or by the knowledge it does not. Now, Dennis Meadows, in his work on the limits of growth, said that he was not too sanguine about developed countries heeding any of this, because he's looked at all of those who have managed to deal, for instance, with population growth, and it has just led to greater expenditure, more material wealth. So I suggest that the only way in which we are really going to get a massive change in the knowledge that is to be amplified with respect to climate change will come from the universities. They're established by cultures and as sources of discovery and of truth. Now, if the universities of the world, acting as a single organ, spoke the same language consistently to governments across the world with respect to this, and 2 of their messages or 3 of their messages might be something like this: that we must move all people living in the developed world to understand that they've been living beyond their means and they must prepare themselves for a far more humble future. We must move all people living in the developing world to understand that they cannot use the present levels of material wealth of the developed countries as their goal for the future. If we could move all people to understand that they must have a wise relationship with nature. And I think if the universities of the world did this consistently, and everywhere where governments thought and acted differently, they'd have a deluge of universities going at them, and I think it might make a change.
Thank you. And number 1.
Thanks. Mohammed Omar from Afghanistan. So I have a one. Sorry. Yes, sorry. I have 3 questions. The first one is belongs to Ms. Elizabeth, about how to make a curriculum of sustainable education. Because in Afghanistan, as all of know, we passed 25 years war, and it's very difficult to go on easily to education and to have a good curriculum. We have a problem in here where UNESCO came into Afghanistan and made a curriculum for adult education and literacy, but the problem is in here, there was the capacity of the employee, of the trainees that can follow this curriculum. And it's very difficult to follow this curriculum because the curriculum is made by other countries as the same copy-paste from the other countries and implemented in Afghanistan without this seeing the rules regarding the culture of Afghanistan. That's the first my question. And the second is about the street children's, and especially and girls' education. It's regarding the economy compared to education. Because most of Afghan people still poor people and they haven't still good money to have a good life. They don't have money to eat, to buy food. How do they have a education? There's a second question. And so the third question belongs to Mr. I forgot the name. How to a social entrepreneur on education. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so we have a question about street children, which is basically a question about equity, which I think we've sort of talked about, but maybe we want to say a little bit more. But we have a question about entrepreneurs in education and getting them involved on environmental questions. And then the first question was, I believe, directed at something to do with the UNESCO initiative. I couldn't quite follow it, but if you followed it, feel free to come in. Otherwise, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to give each of the panelists like a minute or two to summarize the main point they would like you to take away today. And also, for those of you who are interested in applications or in sort of taking this to a pragmatic level, I invite you to join us in the Majlis, in the forum after lunch, where we'll be talking about what works in sustainability and education. But I'm going to ask the panelists in reverse order. So you go first, David, and then you, and then Elizabeth last, okay?
If you really want change, what's the least you can do and expect to have change? I was very active in my younger years in the movement to control tobacco around the world. We did lots of research, and we organized national-level campaigns around the world. And we, with the World Health Organization and international unions, came up with a formula which has actually worked. There are at least 3 things you need for social change. This is speaking in very broad, sweeping terms. You need public awareness. Some people have been talking about that. So you need to use the media, you need to use your educational institutions, you need to use everything at your disposal to create a level of awareness. The second is you need social or community or national or municipal level activity. You need groups of people at the community level to be active. And third, you need policy. You don't get policy unless you have awareness. It's not just that you have awareness or you use public means to convince governments of things. If the government knows that 75% of the population is in favor of something, then it can really make a decision. In the anti-tobacco movement, as soon as we got 75% of the population, we got all kinds of policies passed. And the policies are useful, especially coupled with community activity. And the good thing about environment is that there are many NGOs and environmental groups around the world. And so there is an instrument already existing that we can tie into and network with and reinforce. So using those 3 criteria, I think we can be effective.
Thank you. Yusuf.
Yes, I also want to touch upon the change. And I understand the tobacco cases, and I fully agree with you, but it might be difficult to kind of say the same thing applied to climate change issues, because in case of tobacco, only producer or only smokers have some responsibility, but in case of climate change things, everybody has some responsibility. That's why it's very difficult to agree any consensus on the negotiation. And also about how to change, I think, yeah, people today talk about equity, things, responsibility, also benefit. And I think in terms of benefit, I think normally people think about economic benefit. So the balance between economic benefit and equity or philosophy or ethics is very difficult for me to handle. Sometimes to some people, the ethics argument will work, but sometimes people, for example, politicians, they don't so much moved by those kind of ethical arguments. So I have to make economic argument. You can make money or you can profit in the long run, something like that. But anyway, the balance between those kind of two approach for me is very, very difficult. But that's my profession. I have to manage. I have to do my job. But anyway, sometimes it works. The economic benefit argument works, but sometimes it don't work. But fundamentally, I think ethical argument is more important than economic argument.
Okay. Thank you, Justin. Elizabeth, the last words.
Thank you. At Rio +20 in June of this year, the countries of the world agreed to work toward a global green economy. And what does that mean? It means creating a global economy in which there is growth, where our social values and social systems are protected, where people are protected, but at the same time, we protect the natural resource base on which our social and economic gains and growth are predicated. A good way to do this is to use our educational systems, whether our formal educational systems or informal education systems, whether it has to do with primary, tertiary, secondary, or tertiary levels, to spread information about sustainability and about natural resource protection. Education is lifelong, but sustainability must be as well. And therefore, it isn't the business of the politician alone. It is the business of communities. It is the business of citizens. It is the business of corporations. And all of us have a responsibility and a role to ensure that we get to the point where our natural resources are protected and our societies and economies are growing sustainably.
Thank you. So we have an ethical argument, an economic argument, a strategy for mobilization, and an ambitious program, which it's our responsibility to make sure that our political leaders stick to, adhere to, and perhaps even surpass. Thank you very much for being with us, and thank you even more for sticking with us through what's been a fascinating conversation. Good afternoon.